So this is a deeply personal and deeply emotional thing for me to talk about. I don't talk about it a lot publicly just because I'm a crybaby, and I'm hoping to keep those emotions tamed tonight for you guys. I thought my entire life that I was going to be a civil rights attorney from literally, like, we were joking the other day because Braden, our son, is 16. And when he was in preschool, they were going to do a graduation thing. And all along, Braden had been telling us, I forget, he wanted to be a police cop, I think. For years, he'd been saying that. Well, they get on the stage at graduation, and he said he wanted to be an artist. And it was new to us. We never heard that. And we both looked at each other like, an artist? Okay, that's totally different, but okay, we'll go with it. I never had that waiver from the time that I was a little kid until I was in high school, for sure. I thought the whole time that I was going to be a civil rights attorney, not just any kind of attorney, a civil rights attorney. So even before my family got so affected by the criminal justice system, it was a passion and something that weighed heavy on me, for as long as I can remember. So I just kind of want to give that little bit of background, that when I say I'm passionate about this stuff, I really am, probably a little obsessive about it. But it's a very real thing. And Rick is spot on by saying that it's maybe the foremost issue that we need to deal with when we're talking about racial reconciliation, especially in our country. And it's so easy to let it be out of sight and out of mind. And if it's not something that has impacted you personally, it's very easy to go about your daily life and not really consider what's going on in this kind of subset of society. Just like Rick mentioned, a whole group of people that have never really been able to integrate and enjoy the full freedoms that a lot of other people do. So that's kind of the background where I want to kind of put us. I talked maybe last summer, I think, we did a lot of talking about diversity, and Rick has said it several times that I said that I wanted our group to be one that was so incredibly diverse that people couldn't label us. And that is very much a passion that I have, and that's kind of where I want to come from tonight. And I think in order to get there, we have to deal with some unfortunate truths, some ugly truths, and we have to come to some understanding before we can have that real unity in spirit and in body and in mind, and be truly unified to the extent that I hope that we grow to be. We've got to, pull the Band-Aid off a little bit and look at some things that are challenging to talk about, challenging to acknowledge and to live through and talk about, especially when it's not been your experience. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm going to put Deacon Stevenson on the hot seat real quick. I'm just going to ask him to pray before I get started over that. Thank you, Deacon. He was ill prepared.
Father, I thank you for this opportunity for us to be together again. Just ask that you use Asha this evening, Father. Just let her words be your words. Let her message be your message, Father. We just ask that as far as her voice will carry, that it's met with open ears and receptive hearts, and people who are willing to listen and maybe rethink some things, and maybe have their opinions changed on some things, or be open to hearing a new opinion if they haven't heard some of this stuff before. I just ask that you just bless her tonight. Just bless everything that she has to say. Give her the right words. Give her the right message, and really give her the right heart tonight to speak the things that you would have her speak, Father. We are so blessed and fortunate to have her speaking about things that I feel really are important to society, but also important to your kingdom, Father. And issues of the heart. And we all know that you seek to change hearts and to transform the condition of heart. So we thank you for, again, this opportunity to worship you. And we thank you for this opportunity to hear your message being delivered through Asha. Father, we love you, and we seek your will in these tough times. And we seek your mercy and your blessings on this country. We ask for these things in Jesus' name.
Okay, so I want to start with the idea of becoming unified and becoming one in Christ. So we're going to start there, and then I'm going to kind of work our way back to talk about how we are going to get there and where we've come from. So all you guys that still turn pages in a Bible and don't use your electronic devices, or if you do, let's go to Ephesians 4 first. This is one of my favorites. And it says, as a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is but one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father for all, who is over all and through all and in all. Dion and I were talking on the way over here about something that Malcolm had said a couple of weeks ago about how when we're really truly united, if any one of us hurts for any reason, we hurt with them. And that's kind of the spirit that I kind of want to come and attack this thing tonight. And I'm hoping that you guys are of the same mind. So keep that in mind as we're kind of going through this. I've got one more for you. Let's go over to Galatians chapter 3 and all the way down to verse 23. I know, I'm just did get there, and I'm watching page turners over here. So it says, before the coming of this faith, we were held in custody under the law, locked up, until the faith that had come would be revealed. So the law was our guardian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. Listen to this. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heir according to the promise. So there's not any longer a chosen people. We're all chosen. We're all God's people. And again, that's kind of where the lens that I'm hoping will listen and receive everything that's kind of coming at as we get through. I am going to talk about my experience with Tara. It's tough. Like I said, it's really tough for me to talk to because it's real life for me. It's something that stirs a lot of emotion and a lot of anger and resentment and things like that. So it can be a little bit tough. I'm going to hold on to that, and we're going to talk about that kind of as we get through towards the end. But the legacy of incarceration in our country really goes back to the very roots of our nation. And so I'm not going to start at the beginning, but we're going to kind of go over a little bit of those things. But just to talk about what the prison population looks like right now, it's a huge industry. The United States right now has only 5% of the global population, but we house 25% of the world's prison population. That's astronomical. It's unreal. Since 1970, our prison population has increased more than 700% since 1970. We're talking 40 years, and we're now at a little over 2.3 million enslaved people in prison right now. Last year, 2019, Black males constituted 6.5% of the total U.S. population, right? Very small percentage of the U.S. population, less than 10%. And yet, we're 40% of the overall prison population in America. 6.5% of the total population, but 40% of the prison population. That just makes me, every time I think about it. When we talk about women, especially from 1980 to 2017, the number of women in jails and prisons in the U.S. grew over 750%. It's incredible. Now, I want to tell you that crime rates didn't grow those numbers, but the prison rates grew absent crime actually fluctuating that much. We're going to talk about that. So where I really kind of want to get started is talking about the end of slavery in the U.S. So we had the Civil War. You know, we're going to kind of skip to the end of that period and talk about the 13th Amendment. This is super important. So the 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolished slavery in the United States, right? However, there was a caveat in Section 1 of the 13th Amendment that opened the door to what we see now as mass incarceration. Section 1 of the 13th Amendment said, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except, now hear this, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to this jurisdiction. So they're saying we absolutely are done with slavery. We are abolishing it. It's no longer legal. You've got to free your enslaved people, except as a punishment for crime. And in that area, all bets are off. Okay? So it was just a way to morph the system of servitude that we had and change it a little bit, rebrand it, put a new name on it, and we're still going to do it. So a lot of people have not understood how that happened. So think about it like this. In the South in particular, especially where there was large plantations, large farms, slave labor absolutely was critical to the success of those farms and those plantations. And we have the federal government that's now said, that's illegal. We can't do that anymore. You're not allowed to own human beings as property. You've got to release them. The government reimbursed or gave grants and things for other losses of property, but not for the loss of the greatest asset of those Southern slave owners, right? Their greatest wealth, their greatest assets lied in the human property that they own. So they didn't get money for losing that asset. And now they also didn't have the ability to work their farms and plantations. So the Southern elites, who were, you know, the largest slave owners in the area, who were also the politicians and the government officials, came up with systems to exploit this little caveat in the 13th Amendment to allow kind of a re-enslavement. So they came up with a system called black codes. You guys have probably heard a little bit about that. Those are some really kind of way out there laws are instituted that allowed them to imprison freedmen for virtually anything. I mean, sometimes extremely minor and small issues, things like what we would consider jaywalking or vagrancy or not having a job. So they were required to have these contracts for employment that would last a year or more with the former slave owners. And so if they were in violation of those contracts, or they were loitering, or just the appearance of doing anything wrong, they could be tried, convicted, sent to prison for sometimes extremely lengthy prison sentences. And then the prisons they set up this system called convict leasing and lease the convicted people back to the slave owners to work again in those same conditions. So like I said, it was really just a, lack of a better way of saying it, a rebranding of slavery, right? Now, I will say that the time period right after emancipation wasn't necessarily all bad. That was certainly a very dark and dirty part of it. But really, there were some really cool and inspiring things that were occurring right after emancipation. So we had the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in 1865. The very next year, there was a Civil Rights Act of 1866 that granted full citizenship to all persons. Had not been the case before. The 14th Amendment in the years after that granted or prohibited the denial of due process. So that meant that you couldn't be unfairly tried and convicted, and that you had to have the same protection under the law as everyone else. And then the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the right to vote for freemen. Incredible stuff was happening, right? This is a little short time period that we called Reconstruction, where there was waves of Black folks that were starting to vote and hold public offices and buy property and kind of gain some advances in society. But it was really short-lived. I was telling Rick earlier, there's a quote by W.E.B. Du Bois that said, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery." It didn't take but just that long for people to look around and say, okay, wait, this is not working for us. We got to get back, right? Just imagine, this was in the 1860s, 1870s. What if we'd gotten it right then? What might our country look like right now today? It's incredible. They were on the right track. They were doing things right. And greed and power, derailed us. And so now we're going back and starting to have some of these conversations that, maybe wouldn't have been necessary if we'd continued on that path and gotten it right. It's just, it causes a pause in me to just stop for a minute and think, these are 3-4 generations of greats back that we could have been done. We could have been done and on the other side of this. And yet here we are today talking about how it's an issue to deal with again. Okay, so from those Black codes, the end of Reconstruction, things reverted back in a lot of ways. And then we had what most of us are familiar with. We moved into the Jim Crow system, where it was incredibly obvious what was intended. They didn't hide it. It was overt. We had signs hanging everywhere. We had laws saying that, we had separate but equal, and the Plessy-Ferguson ruling. The Supreme Court was standing behind all of these things that said, actually, we're not going to give them real full citizenship. We're going to only allow them to do these few things and move in these certain ways and behave as we've told them and taught them, and to kind of keep Black folks in a subordinate, separate underclass of society. So I just think about, there have, even in my lifetime, getting into the civil rights movement into the 40s and 50s and 60s, even still seeing remnants of some of those signs and things, even here in Ardmore. If you remember going downtown, there were shops downtown. And up until a couple years ago, when the building collapsed, there was a building on Main Street in Ardmore that still had the signs for the water fountains. I'm talking 3, 4, 5 years ago in Ardmore. So I hear people a lot say, that was so long ago. We're talking, that was in the 60s. My parents were little, except it wasn't. Those things carry over and they bleed into so many things. And when I hear those kind of things, I think even in my lifetime, I've seen those signs, and maybe it wasn't legal, but it was still there. And from where I sit, as a form of humiliation and control, and a need to make sure that people know their place in society. Why else would you still have that prominently displayed? Not in a museum, but still in the same business functioning and operating today, where you have people of all backgrounds that shop. So it's not that far removed. I think that's something that I want everybody to kind of keep conscious about, that these things that we're talking about are not that far removed. My mom grew up just outside of Ardmore, and she was born in 1957. So she saw a lot of these things, and she talks about coming to town in Ardmore and experiencing those things, and going into the backs of restaurants and upstairs at the Tivoli Theater downtown in Ardmore, instead of coming in the main entrance, and sitting in the balcony, and just so many things. And so when I hear people talk about how long ago some of these things are, it doesn't feel that long ago or that far removed for me and for people that look like me, I think, because so many of these things have kind of bled over into our lives even today. So let's fast forward a little bit. So we get into the civil rights movement. We start to see some progress again, right? We start to see some new Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and some real movement starting to happen, not without a lot of painful things to get there, but lots of good things coming up. I want to challenge you guys just a little bit, because this is something that we don't really talk about a whole lot. But as the civil rights movement was kind of rolling forward and we're getting to the end of the 60s, one thing that we don't really discuss very much is kind of how the movement changed. So in the end of the 60s, around 67, 68, there was a major shift by leaders of the movement, especially Dr. King and the SCLC, to shift the movement not just from civil rights for Black people, but to engage all folks into a war against poverty. And that's not really talked about very much. At the end of the 67, they had organized a Poor People's Campaign, a Poor People's March on Washington, very much like the one several years ago they did for the beginning of the civil rights movement. And it's, to me, no surprise that when he was organizing and unifying, right, people from all backgrounds who shared the common characteristic of being living in poverty, and they were calling for economic reform and a system of economic justice for, I mean, we're talking poor whites, Latinos, Blacks, Puerto Ricans, all joining together and heading to DC for this march and this new campaign. When he first announced it, it was less than a month later when Dr. King was assassinated. And that's not something that we discuss very often, but at the root of so many of these issues, at some point, we're going to have to deal with that also, that when we go to hit the money, right, that's where it hurts a lot. And we always kind of assumed that it was just because of his civil rights rhetoric and things like that, but it really wasn't necessarily that, at least just from what I think. It was when we started unifying and coming together for a common purpose and kind of going after the money, things, you know, became unbearable, and we weren't going to allow that. So through all of that, there's some political tie-ins that we kind of have to discuss too. So especially during the civil rights movement, politicians especially kind of were coming up with this idea that we have to stop this, right? This is getting out of control. It's too much. They're coming after the money. We really don't want to see this unity. And so we started to hear some kind of racially coded language, kind of rallying cries against some of these things. And one of the most prolific, and the thing that I think is still carrying over so much into what we see today, is this Get Tough movement, and this that led to this war on drugs. So we saw, especially with Nixon, start to call, and really it really kind of started at the end of the civil rights movement anyway. They started to show pictures of demonstrators and talking about how lawless people were being. And it was those people who were breaking laws and causing anarchy and chaos and things like that, and they needed to be controlled. And that just kind of kept morphing and changing. And then on into the 70s, it got real serious, okay? So they were creating images to demonize Black folks as criminals, even without it really being substantiated. It's like, you know, people complain all the time about the media and how the media today chooses the narrative, right? The media will show us pictures over and over and over until we start to believe certain things about certain people and things like that. That's exactly what was going on. It was by design. So we're talking about the systematic and very calculated and planned approach to start to categorize and criminalize people of color. So it was early in the late 70s and beginning in the early 80s where that really started to take hold. And it's been kind of widely accepted that the war on drugs that we still hear about today was in response to this really out of control crack epidemic, right? That's kind of the accepted thoughts on how that came to be. I'm going to challenge you a little bit and say that's not true. Okay? So this war on drugs really was manufactured long before there was ever really a drug problem. In fact, Nixon coined the term, and then early as he was running for president, President Reagan really kind of took off with this idea in the early 80s. At the time when he declared this war on drugs in 82, less than 2% of the US population believed that drugs were the number one issue that we faced in the country. So nobody in the country thought it was an issue, right? And yet we created an entire war on drugs. I mean, just stop for a second and think about that. Think about the pictures that we've seen over the years, especially in regards to the crack cocaine epidemic, right, that we've heard so much about for so many years. Nixon actually hired a team of people with the only job, the only intent was to push media images and stories about how bad crack cocaine was in the inner cities and how bad it was taking hold and what it was destroying lives and how terrible it was, long before there was ever any real meat to that. And really, a lot of what's happening in those cities and towns was attributable to even deindustrialization from large factories that were once, located in some inner city areas that were easy to get to. You really started to have a mass exodus of that with globalization and increased technology and things like that. Those jobs went away, leaving those communities a lot of times destitute and a lot of people jobless in those communities. And so a lot of the images that you were seeing were probably more attributable to deindustrialization than they were to this supposed crack epidemic. But there was money behind it, and there was a motive behind it. So as we started this war on drugs, let me tell you how the money increased behind what was being said. So in the early 80s, we'll say between 1980 and 84, the FBI's anti-drug funding increased from $8 million a year to $95 million a year for this non-existent problem, right? So we created this problem. We said, now we're going to give you all this money to go and wage this war on drugs. Same thing happened for the other agencies. The DEA went from like 86 million during that same time frame to over $1 billion a year in the DEA's budget to fight this war on drugs. And a lot of times, we were thinking, we were hearing, we were hoping that what they were going to do was go after the most violent criminals, right? The drug lords and the kingpins and things like that. But they were getting funding for the sheer volume of people that were arrested. So what were they doing? They were going into neighborhoods and they were getting the lowest hanging fruit, right? And then we started to see things on into the late 80s and the 90s, and we had the 3 strikes penalty in California, where you could have 3 low-level felonies that meant now you were going to serve the rest of your life in prison. So sometimes you had 3 people, or 3 times, 3 strikes for a drug offense, and there goes the whole rest of your life, right? For sometimes crimes that you're not even guilty of committing. And I think that's maybe what blows my mind the most, because I know that it happens because I lived it. And I think we think there's so many checks and balances in our criminal justice system that, innocent people don't go to jail. And I want to tell you guys, that is absolutely false. I can say it because I lived it. I live it every day. It happens. It happens swiftly. And before you know it, you're deep into it and you had no idea even what happened. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories about in Oklahoma City. Let me just say that in Oklahoma City, there is a criminologist, Joyce Gilchrist, who worked for the Oklahoma City Police Department for, I don't know, 30 years or so, and has had dozens and dozens of cases overturned because of falsifying evidence to increase their conviction rates, working with Bob Macy, the Oklahoma County District Attorney. It's not something new, it's not unusual, and it's not something that even here in Oklahoma we're immune to. It's not something that happens other places. It happens here, and it happens frequently. So a lot of these incarcerated people, and especially in poor and neighborhoods of people of color, have gotten into the system a lot of times for solely being poor and being low-hanging fruit, and people who can't afford an attorney. And in another system where we have, overworked public defenders who don't have the funding to do their jobs properly. That's a rabbit hole I'll go deeper down another time. But it's not just a matter of, we hear all the time people say, well, if you're not in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing, if you're not committing the crime, you don't have to worry about that. But I want to tell you that's not true. It's not the case. It's not the case at all. When we were first going through Tara's ordeal, we met a woman from Dallas who had been wrongfully incarcerated for 20 years and was exonerated. And her story is incredible. She was working at a place that's a retail store that sells fur coats, oddly enough. And there was a woman, her name is Joyce Ann Brown. There was a woman of the same name. It's the only coincidence they had the same name, Joyce Ann Brown, who had committed a murder across town. Now, there was no eyewitness. There was no any account that this Joyce Ann Brown was there, had any connection to what happened or anything like that. And the police showed up at her work, arrested her. She went on trial and was convicted and served 20 years in prison for a crime that she was not even physically present to commit, because she had the same name as someone. It happens, and it's very, very difficult, nearly impossible, to unright the wrong in so many ways. There's so many hurdles to fixing it. So if we don't get it right on the backside, it's very difficult to come out on the other side unscathed. So the idea that, just wake up, get a job, work hard, don't commit crime, and you won't have these problems is moot for me, because I've seen it way too many times to know that it's far too easy for this kind of thing to happen. So as we kind of have gotten into policing today, just living in our society today, clearly the systems of Jim Crow and the overt signs of, blacks here and whites here and colors here and whites there, and that thing has gone away, right? But not necessarily really gone away. We don't see the signs designating our place in society, but there are still so many conscious and unconscious biases that govern our daily lives and our decisions and how we interact with people, that we have to start talking about that. And some of this stuff is just generational things that we've been taught over the years, that we've seen, that we've heard from people, that systems have told us, that the media has shown us. Even like I was saying, in the 80s when we had the crack epidemic and the beginning of the war on drugs, all you saw were images of crack addicted babies, right? Crack prostitutes walking the streets, welfare queens. And can I tell you that the rate of drug use and abuse amongst Black people and the rate of drug use and abuse against white people are identical, absolutely identical, and even of selling drugs. But if I ask you to close your eyes right now and picture a drug dealer, what comes to your mind. That's by design, right? We have to be really conscious about the images and the pictures that we're seeing every day and thinking about what the agenda might be behind it. Where did that come from? Why do we believe those things? And how might it be affecting how we interact with those people on a day-to-day basis? Same thing even for police officers and for doctors and teachers. I've had so many women that I know of, Black women, who, I'll go one further. My mom had a procedure done about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was an outpatient procedure. And so I picked her up, and then she was kind of out of it. We headed home, and I realized that she didn't have a prescription for any pain medicine. And I called and called and called and called, couldn't get anybody. We were, chewing Tylenol and ibuprofen like crazy, and it took me 2 days to get in touch with her doctor's office to get her some real pain medicine. I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's an accident. It's tough. It's tough to say it, and I know it's tough to kind of hear it too. But there's a legacy of that in this country. There is a doctor who, earned his stripes operating on enslaved Black women without anesthesia because he believed that they didn't feel pain the same as white women. And you guys don't believe me, Google it. There are doctors even now coming out of medical school who will tell you that they don't believe that Black people feel pain the same as white people. And a lot of times we have a difficult time getting pain medicine accurately and effectively after surgeries. I have friends who have had C-sections, having their children, birthing their children, who have said, they had a hard time getting the doctors and nurses sometimes to get their pain medicine to them because there has been this undercurrent of thought that it's different, or that they're drug seeking or able to withstand the pain better because of the DNA of Black people. So these are real things, and it's real experiences, and we have to, like I said, there's ugly truths that we have to talk about and we have to deal with. So, okay, let's get back to criminalization of folks. So the Supreme Court has made it really difficult to protect our Fourth Amendment, which was guarantees against unreasonable search and seizure. So now, police have to have probable cause or permission to search your person or your property. Now, a lot of times that permission in a traffic stop is, officer walking up to your vehicle with his hand on your holster and saying, "Stick your hands up, let me search you." And you go, "Yes, sir, officer." What else are you going to say, right? So then that a lot of times leads to these stop and frisk policies or searches that sometimes turn to something and sometimes don't. And then we get those folks involved in the criminal justice system for, crimes like driving while Black. I can tell you personally, in Ardmore, Oklahoma, driving an SUV with 2 car seats in the back, that I had a police officer pull me over for my taillight being out and approach the car with his gun drawn. And he wasn't aiming it at us, but it was out of the holster and kind of pointed down as he walked to the car. I've never been more scared in my life. In Ardmore, Oklahoma, just me and 2 kids in the back seat in car seats. For what reason? For a taillight? I can't imagine that most people drive around concerned about that or thinking that they need to feel concerned about a routine traffic stop for tail. I knew my taillight was out. I just hadn't got around to changing it, right? It's not like probably a lot of you guys haven't driven around with a taillight out or with a tag that expired yesterday or things like that, and just not thought about, the consequences that may come of that. So here's where it gets really challenging. We get people who have an interaction that leads them into the criminal justice system. They go in, they complete their sentences, and then they're released. Now, the way our system is designed right now, it is incredibly difficult to successfully reintegrate back into our society. Our current criminal justice system more or less makes it legal to employ all of those systems of discrimination that were once used against African Americans, and enslaved people. So we're talking about discrimination in housing, discrimination in employment, in federal benefits. Do you know that most convicted people who have had a felony conviction cannot receive federal grants or loans for college? Now, we're telling them you need to get out, get an education, make something of yourself, but we're taking away the ability to do that. On federal housing, they don't have access in most states to federally assisted housing, to food stamps. We can't get a job, you can't find a place to live, and you can't feed yourself because we don't allow convicted felons to have access to any of those programs that would help them get on their feet. Add to that, there are astronomical fees and fines that people who have been released from prison have to face. So if you are out on probation or parole, you probably have a GPS monitoring device. The released person has to pay for that. You're paying court fines and fees from whatever crime you committed or were convicted of that got you there. Back child support. Your child support doesn't stop when you're convicted. It compounds. So you're paying that. All of this without a job, right? And a lot of times without transportation, without access to housing, without access to, food stamp benefits. How do you pay that? How do you pay those hundreds of dollars a month that you're probably required to pay, sometimes thousands? Who's paying that and how? It's a cycle that is incredibly difficult to come out of. And we wonder why recidivism rates are sometimes at 70% or higher. Those people come home, they try very hard to make a start of it, but we have so many barriers in place that keep them from being able to make the fresh start that we expect them to do, that they have sometimes no other choice but to get back involved into criminal activity that maybe led them there. We spend an enormous amount of money punishing people and almost no money diverting those behaviors early on or supporting them when they are released and come back into society. And that's something that we absolutely have to change. Let me tell you a little bit about my family's experience with the criminal justice system, with prison today. So most of you guys have heard Rick's talking about my story about my sister. I was 15 years old. My sister was 19 years old, a single mom, and she was convicted she was arrested in 97, convicted in 98 to a life sentence for a crime that she wasn't present to commit. It was by far the most defining moment of my life, and clearly of hers too. It's been 23 years, and it is something that is at the forefront of just almost everything that happens in our family every single day. It has financially bankrupt us several times over. Aside from just the injustice of it all, the cost of having a family member incarcerated is astronomical. I'll just give you an idea of just some basic things that we deal with just caring for her. There are telecommunication charges, okay, just to be able to communicate. And they are unbelievable. I probably spend gosh, I don't know, maybe $50 a month just in telephone calls. And that's because we're on a schedule now. Like, we have cut it back a little bit. So we talk however long, we have 15-minute conversations. We talk a couple times a week, but there are months when she's having bad months when it's can be $300, $400, $500 a month where she just needs to talk about what's going on and how she's feeling. There's the commissary in prison that is unbelievably expensive. So, of course, meals are terrible. So the commissary can provide toiletries, feminine hygiene products, sometimes snacks and food, medicines, and so let me back up just a little bit. Most incarcerated people are required to have a job while they're in prison. And there are state laws that govern that they have to be paid. Well, most of the pay is pennies on the dollar. So I think I had it somewhere, but I've misplaced it. But I want to say in Oklahoma, if you have a regular job, meaning like you work in the laundry facility, in the cafeteria, in the library at the prison, you're making anywhere from 4 cents an hour to like 35 cents an hour on average. Okay, that's what they're paid for that work. Now, they use that pay, it's called state pay, for the state jobs that they're working in the prisons. They use that pay to purchase from the commissary their hygiene supplies, their toothbrush, toothpaste, underwear, anything that you would need in daily life. And when I tell you the markup is incredible for that stuff, I'm talking, probably $7 or $8 for a stick of deodorant, $6 or $7 for a toothbrush. And we're talking about people are making 4 cents an hour to be able to pay for those things. It's unreal. They also have expenses to be seen by a medical provider. So at Mabel Bassett, where my sister is, to be seen by a medical provider, a doctor or nurse or nurse practitioner, they have a $5 office visit, and plus they have to pay for any medicines. So again, we're talking about people that are making, maybe up to 30 cents an hour, and we're paying $5 for medical care, and then for any prescriptions. My sister has developed some ongoing health issues since she's been there, and so has medicines every month that we have to pay for. Now, the state houses these people, but we pay for their housing. In addition, a lot of these folks in some states, Oklahoma's not one of them, Indiana is though, in a lot of states, when they're released, on top of the fines and court costs and all the other supervision fees and things, a lot of the states have now adopted laws that require the released persons to pay back their charges for incarceration. Hear me when I say this. You were incarcerated for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, and the state is now charging you and requiring you to pay that back on top of all of the other things that you're paying without a job, without access to health care, without access to housing, without food. And we're just making it incredibly difficult for these people to ever be part of real society and be really, truly free. It's suffocating to think about. It feels like, for me, just a brick on my chest when I think about the struggles that people who look like me especially, are going through. It's something that we have to hit head on. We have to talk about, we have to advocate for, and we have to disallow these things to continue. So what are some things that we can do? I know we're getting all of this information right now about all of these injustices and all these different parts of our society, and how a lot of us, some of it I'm sure, are hearing for the first time, but there's things that we need to address. We have to stop, right? I think first we have to, as a church especially, um, we have to speak on it, and we have to speak the whole truth about it. And um, it can't be comfortable. These are uncomfortable things to talk about, but we as a church have to be out front, and we have to make it known. We have to condemn the practices that lead to these sort of things. Um, we have to recognize that just because things are not impacting us personally and individually, because it's not your sister or brother, or you're not um, personally impacted, your brother or sister over here is. So you have to kind of take that on yourself too. We have to make visible what's been hidden in plain sight. And so many of the things that we've been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks are things that we have chosen not to see in a lot of ways, right? Because maybe it didn't affect us, but we can't do that anymore. We absolutely have to make it visible. We have to have the conversations. We have to speak out for it. We have to call a thing a thing. And even beyond that, we have to advocate for systems that will reverse some of these things, right? We have to advocate, especially when we're talking about criminal justice and reform and those sort of things, we have to advocate for systems that emphasize prevention and rehabilitation, and not just punishment, right? Because whether or not we're talking about, people that we felt were, guilty and convicted and deserve the time and all that, they still, at some point, 85% of people who go to prison and jail will be back in society. What do we do then, right? It's incredibly important. We have to talk about how we support and make sure that we have opportunities available so that we don't have to continue this cycle, that we pour funds into education, that we don't have barriers that keep them from getting employment, getting public health, increasing their education opportunities and things like that. Because for the most part, when people go away, especially to prison, especially for long-term sentences, unless they have families that are able to support them, like we have with Tara, they are doing nothing but time. There's no rehabilitation. There's no drug treatment. There's no work skills, life skills, things like that at all. It is strictly punishment. And then they come back with no skills, back into the same situations that they left. I'll say about education, one thing that we've been fortunate, my sister loves to go to school, and she's gotten, I want to say 4 associate's degrees since she's been there. She's got a degree in accounting and business, and I can't remember what. She gets a degree every couple of years. And she's finally gotten into a bachelor's program that she can get a bachelor's degree. But until then, she was just going to keep racking up associate's degrees, I think. But only because my mom and I can pay for it, or not even can pay for it. We do pay for it. But a lot of others have gone into, she for 5 or 6 years was she taught GED classes while she was there, and helped a lot of women get GEDs. Wouldn't have had it any other way, except for other people like Tara, other inmates who were serving long sentences, who had gotten educated, created programs to educate other people. There's not support for it in the system. So gosh, guys, I could talk about this for years, but we have to have some genuine care and some compassion, and realize that this is our responsibility too. It's not just my responsibility because it's in my family, but it's all of us. We all have a responsibility to people, because we are, like we've been saying for weeks and weeks and weeks, that we want to be unified, and we want to all be multiracial, multi-ethnic, all loving each other and living unified. We have to deal with things like this, and we have to shift from this wave of punishment to some community-based interventions and some preventative measures and substance abuse treatment and early and often interventions that would keep people out of the system rather than continuing to feed it and feed it and feed it. Dion and I watched a amazing documentary a couple weeks ago, and if this is something that has kind of perked your interest a little bit, I would really encourage you guys to find it. It's on Netflix. It's an Ava DuVernay, The 13th, and she talks a lot in great detail about the 13th Amendment to today and how that has morphed and changed and what incarceration looks like today and how it's multiplied, what we can do about it, what we should be doing about it. It's an easy watch, but it is very impactful. And I would encourage you guys to look that up on Netflix. Again, I think it's called, is it the 13th or is it the 13th Amendment? 13th. The 13th. It's the 13th. Yeah, 13 something. But for sure, check it out. It is absolutely, I mean, I don't think we moved. We sat and watched the entire thing without movement and learned some things in it too. So if this is something that, like I said, has pierced you a little bit, I would absolutely encourage you guys to look for that and spend some time with it. I just want to say a little bit more. I kind of didn't get very deep into it because I know that I'm a ball bag and it's kind of tough to go very far into it. But I'll say this, when I was 15 years old is when we really had our introduction to the criminal justice system, a real introduction to it. Because like many of you guys, I grew up thinking it's a system that's got all these checks and balances. We have, there's people get a trial, there's an investigation, you get a trial, then you get an appeal, then you get other appeals. And then if you happen to get convicted, there's probation, there's parole, there's all these other things that happen. So I kind of went into all this as a 15-year-old, glossy-eyed and believing in the goodness of people, that wrong things don't happen to right people, and that somewhere along the way, people would make wrongs right. And it did not go that way at all. And as a 15 and 16-year-old, I missed a lot of school. My mom and I spent most of our time, those 2 years, back and forth with attorneys, and all of the attorneys said, oh, this will never make it to court. This will never, you don't even have to worry about it. I mean, it was a no-brainer. She was physically not there. And yet we made it to court. We made it through a trial. We were convicted. And then it was, don't you worry. The judge has a 60-day window to reverse the sentence. I've talked to him. He's going to fix this. He'll make it right. And then he told Tara, he called her, he had the bailiff bring her from the county jail. There was a 60-day review, and let her know that he had the jurisdiction and the discretion to fix it. And he didn't. And in fact, he upheld the sentence, and she received a life in prison sentence. And so then, there was appeals, and we just knew they were going to work. I was naive through this whole process. We got to, she did 15 years and was eligible for parole. And I thought, there is no better candidate for parole than my sister. She, in the 15 years that she at that time had been incarcerated, had not had one single write-up. And let me tell you, you can get a write-up for having too many rolls of toilet paper in your room. You can get a write-up for having the wrong type of rubber band ponytail, or, any kind of thing. She did not have one single misconduct. And to this day, 23 years later, has never been written up for anything ever. It's unreal. It doesn't happen. So the first year, she made it through the first phase. First parole, she made it through the first phase. And we were ecstatic. And so the second phase of parole, you actually get to have a family members come, and they do a video chat kind of thing like this, and you get to talk for 3 minutes. They get to hear your story for 3 minutes, and consider whether or not to recommend you to parole. So we did. My mother and sister and I got to sit together in the room on a video conference, and they asked her 3 questions. They asked her if she'd had any misconducts or write-ups. They asked her if she'd done any programs or education while she was there. And they asked her, one member in particular said, when you were first convicted, you were adamant that you were innocent. It's been 15 years. Are you still telling the story that you're innocent? And the disdain in his voice completely broke her. And she was sitting in between us. My mom's on the left and I'm on the right. And she just looked at me and put her head down with just these huge tears in her eyes. And she said, "What do I say to that?" Because we knew what they were asking. They wanted her to say, "No, I'm sorry for what I did. I, have been rehabilitated and reformed, and, admit to what they had accused and convicted her of." And I just whispered to her, "It's okay, just tell the truth." And she said, "I'm sorry for so many things in my life, but I did not do what they said I did, and I won't say that I did." And right then, in that moment, every single one of them voted against her in that moment. Forget everything else that happened. And that was the last time that she has made it through the first round of parole. So we've had 3 more opportunities since then. And they initially do a jacket review where they just look at your file and check things on a box to see if you would meet the qualifications, which of course she does, but she has never since that moment made it past the jacket review. So we don't see that as an option anymore. And 23 years later, every time my sister calls me and we talk 2-3 times a week, first thing I'll say, "Hey sis, how are you doing?" And she'll say, "Can't wait to come home." Every single time. And guys, that doesn't get any easier. I've heard it thousands of times. We've come at it from just almost every angle. And we did apply earlier this year for a commutation that we feel pretty good about. And so what would happen with that is, we've asked the parole board to commute her sentence from an indefinite rest of your life, no number of years sentence, to a definite number of years. So even now, there was an 85% rule that came out 3 or 4 years ago in Oklahoma, a little longer than that, but basically said that you had to serve 85% of your sentence. Well, that was after she was convicted, but it did kind of bring about this idea that life sentences are now 45 years and not indefinite. So that's part of what we have, our latest attempt has been to get her home, was just that if you would even change it from this indefinite life sentence to a 45-year, she'd almost be home, because she accrues something crazy like 6 or 8 days for every 1 day that she's there, because of her level and the fact that she's never had any misconducts or been written up and things like that. So we're hoping after 23 years now, that they will at least give us 45 years so that we have an opportunity to maybe have an end in sight. So when I say it's real, it's every day. It's so real. And I just hope that hearing some of this makes it a little more real for you guys. Even as you hear things on TV, that you will just pause for a minute and think about the people involved and the lives and the families and the children who have lost their parents, sometimes for extremely minor things. And just look a little deeper, think a little harder, do a little bit more investigating when you hear things said, because things are not always as they seem. And we have to do better. We have to change this. We cannot allow these things to just continue to grow. It's such a big industry. We could go on and on and on. The private prison industry is incredible. It's huge. And now that we are starting to see some reforms, they're changing their tactics. And it's always a money thing. Now they are, corrections, I forget what it is, CCA, they've now started getting into monitoring. So as more people are getting paroled and sent home, now they've shifted from building so many private prisons to, now we're going to take care and handle all the fines and the monitoring so they can still find a way to monetize this. It's a big deal, guys. It's a lot of stuff. And it's going to take everybody. It's going to take everybody feeling and understanding and championing the issue. And not just me, not just people like me who have a direct connection to it, but it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us calling a thing and requiring change, not just accepting that this is just the way things are. Those are just those people, those people need to be punished. Those people, kind of deserve that. We have to take this on for everybody. And it's not just about those people over there. It's about all of us. Okay, I can go on all night. I think we better tame it. I went way longer than I had to. I appreciate you guys. I will gladly have deeper and more in-depth conversations with anybody that wants to. There's so much here, and there's layers and levels, and it goes on and on and on, and it's pervasive in so many systems. That, like I said, we could do a series and not touch on everything. No, I didn't get to that. That's a big part of it too, Beth. It's on my list. I skipped it. Just sentencing disparities. We didn't get to sentencing disparity, but that's a big part of it too. That's on section 3. We'll talk about that another time. I'll just say real quick about sentencing disparity. Real quick. So if we can just backtrack, we're talking about real quick this war on drugs. The powder cocaine and crack cocaine has been a huge topic, a huge issue for sentencing guidelines, right? And I don't know what it is right offhand, but the chemical makeup of crack cocaine and powder cocaine is almost identical. Crack cocaine gives a little bit faster, more intense high, but doesn't last as long as powder cocaine. But generally, as far as how destructive they are almost identical. One is a little bit more glamorous, and one is a little bit cheaper, and usually found in poorer areas and inner cities and things like that. Now, when in the 90s, especially with the Clinton administration, the end of the Reagan era, the Clinton administration, when they really started to crack down on this war on drugs, and especially the crack cocaine epidemic, they made sentencing guidelines for all these different types of crimes, drugs in particular. So this is not exactly accurate, but you could have, you know, this is way off, but let's say, you know, you could have 500 grams of powder cocaine to be considered a felony, but something like 1 or 2 grams of crack cocaine and it be considered a felony. Okay. So even just in how that was applied to people doing the same thing with virtually the same drug, it was very clear who the target was, right? Who the target for incarceration is. And very often, especially when we're talking about drug offenses, an incredibly large amount of people in prison for petty crimes and drug offenses who probably would have benefited more from an inpatient rehabilitation program, from getting jobs, from getting, you know, education and training, than for just the punitive part of going to jail, because we haven't dealt with the root cause of what would have sent them there. So just in the sentencing alone, we have incredible disparity between someone who is sentenced for felony possession of crack cocaine versus someone sentenced for a felony possession of powder cocaine, right? Generally, people who are sentenced with powder cocaine are white, and most people who get convicted and sentenced of crack cocaine are Black. And the sentences were incredibly more harsh for those convicted of powder cocaine. Like I said, that's just one tiny area where we talk about sentencing disparity. It's like Bishop Jake said on that video I think Gary shared several weeks ago. And he said, on one side of town, you get convicted or picked up for, you know, being high or having drugs, and it's a health crisis. Like we see right now with the opioid epidemic, it's a health crisis. But when it was crack cocaine, right, it's a criminal problem and they must be punished. It's the mindset behind those different types of things, where one type of abuse is a health problem and they need treatment, and the other calls for punishment. And the only real difference is the way the person who was convicted or arrested looks. It's the only real difference between what we're talking about with the crack epidemic and the opioid crisis of today. When you think about someone, we talk about, you know, how destructive meth addiction and the opioid crisis is right now, and you close your eyes and you picture that person, it's somebody that needs help, right? It's destructive. When we think about crack and the people who are addicted to crack, they don't need help, they need punishment. And that's where we've gotten a lot of these numbers from. Like I said, it's pervasive. There's so many things. We can go so deep on that. Thanks for the reminder, Beth. But that's definitely something that we have to talk about. And those are things that we have to change. And there's been a little bit of reform in that area, but not nearly enough. And we have to speak about it more and make it an issue that we won't budge on, right? It has to be an absolute, we are going to call this thing out and we're going to address it and we're going to deal with it. My biggest passion, of course, is for people wrongfully convicted, because that's where it hits me the most. But we have to talk about all of these issues, all of it. It's not just about any one of them. We have to talk about all of them, and we have to fix it. And I'm so grateful for this Gen Z group, because, you know, a lot of us have become complacent, and we have just kind of accepted that some things are the way that they are, and man, it's too big for us to tackle, and we're just going to have to hope it gets better. But they're not a generation of hoping things get better. They're calling for action, and man, I'm energized by it. I'm here for it. I'm excited to see what's changing and how rapidly things are changing. So yeah, sentencing disparity, it's on the list also. Are you joining me?
I think so. I was told that.
Everybody hang on, here comes the deacon.
Shut your face. No, just the prevailing thought when I was listening to Asha is how I hate to use the word flawed, but how broken are we as a people when we can't get to a place where we feel like enough is enough, where we continually feel like we have to punish people to a point to where their spirit is broken. And unfortunately, in our world, the thing that changes minds in our country is your wallet. When your wallet is attacked, when your income is compromised in some way, then that's when we get the change. And I think, if I'm being completely honest, that is the greatest failure of the church, is that to get things moving in our country, it takes financial ramifications rather than a change, rather than an encounter with God and a proper encounter with the church to change hearts and change minds. And that's what I was thinking throughout this, because if just about everything that Asha laid out so perfectly, the trail led back to money. And that's really unfortunately right now, the only way things change is there's a thing going on right now in Washington with its professional football team. And the tides have shifted because of money, because the right people said, we're going to take away money if you don't make something that you know is clearly wrong right. When is the church going to start being the equivalent of monetary value in our world, in our country? That is an indictment right now, if I'm being completely honest with you. We have got to be the champions of change and the champion of people. Right now, we are this world is too busy making a dollar instead of making a change. Mm-hmm. And until that changes, until we, like Asha said, until we see hurt and pain from you as important, not because I know you, but because you're a human, then we're going to continue to struggle with these things that we're struggling with. The prison system is just symbolic of this nation and this country as a whole. We push away and we try to throw away the undesirables, and we try to push them so far away, and we try to beat them so far down to dehumanize them so we don't have to feel, so we don't have to think about it. It's easy to be okay with so many injustices in the world if you don't see me as an equal. It's like Asha mentioned earlier with her mother and the pain medications. If I don't think you feel pain, then I'm dehumanizing you. You don't feel things the way that I do, so it's easier for me to feel okay going to bed at night knowing that I hurt you, because it didn't hurt you as bad because you're not human. You're not like me. You don't feel the things that I feel. You don't suffer the way that I suffer when things go bad. But it's just sadness when I think about everything that she said tonight. Just absolute sadness. Because again, the church has to be more vital to our survival than dollars. And right now, everything and everyone is moved by money and is changed by money. That's not the way it's ever supposed to have been, and that's certainly not going to get us to where we need to be. But unfortunately, right now, that's the thing that I see. Some of the things that are changing in society, it's changing because of people saying, okay, well, I'm going to take away the financial part of it. That's the only thing. If that's the only thing that makes you change your mind, if that's the only reason why you see me as a human because of my dollar, then I haven't really changed you. You're going to find another way to devalue me. I promise you, it will not stop with money. We need heart transplants. I say it week after week, after week after week. But guys, we need heart transplants.
And only God can do that, not a dollar bill. No amount of zeros can change your heart. It's just going to reflect what's already in there. And the things that are going on in this country right now ought to be evident. It ought to be evident that you can't throw enough money into the problem to fix this stuff. You can't. And that's really all I had to say. I turn the mic to you. That means you talk. Right now?